So what we will be trying to do is, like maybe every day or every other day, we'll try to have a few minutes drawing some of the threads together, right? So, so I'll just start by saying a few things. Like, for example, one of the, beginning maybe with what Michael was saying today, one of the things, one of the threads would be this whole question of the of these spatial contexts for design in China. And I mean, I was talking about that, and I think Michael's paper today was on that. And I think one of the things he said, of course, is that you know, China today, of course, has gone far beyond the surrealistic. I mean, that's entirely true, because I mean, surrealism tries to shock. Today, even the most shocking things are no longer shocking. They've become ordinary, right? So this whole question of the how we've gone beyond shock towards what? I mean, is it, for example, a certain kind of trauma? I mean, is it a kind of traumatized state? But it's a kind of happy traumatized state. I mean, you're traumatized but happy at the same time. But but the question is, you know, what leads up to all this? Now, I think one of the things that link it up would be, or one of the symptoms would be this sort of blurring of distinctions between the monumental and the ordinary or the everyday. I mean, other people have spoken about it. I mean, particularly Benjamin, right? This is basically this notion of this situation that produces what Benjamin calls profane illumination, right? But another angle on why, you know, these lines are blurring would be, I think, an idea that has been running through these discussions, which is the idea of speed, right? And it's speed in the sense that someone like Paul Virilio has theorized. And one of the things that Virilio says about speed is this, that speed, besides being a dimension in its own right, something that we really have to think about, it's not just the dimensions of space and time. Speed is now itself another dimension, but it also has this ability to problematize all the other dimensions, right? So what speed does is to make, for example, big and small, far and near, right? The past and the future, right? Completely blurred. And you can go, for example, from speed to something like these replica cities that Michael was talking about, right? Thames, what was it? Thames Town, right? These replica cities where the past is now completely recreated, right? What we're doing here now is like consuming the past, or you might say the past as repast, right? I mean, you're eating it, right? It's the past is a form of, it's a meal. It's a repast that you have. Now, then, of course, you know, if you think about speed in this way, and then speed in China, I mean, there's other kinds of speed, but like the speed of change in China, I think one of the first things we will have to say is not just this thing that everyone says, which is that, you know, China is changing very quickly, of course. Yeah, we all know that, right? But it's not only China, it's not only the fact that China is changing, it's also the fact that change is changing, right? It's like the nature of change itself is changing. I mean, the things are changing in ways that we don't understand. I think that is something we need to sort of take account of. And, you know, that's also a kind of much more specific local angle to this about speed. I mean, for example, what is called Shenzhen speed, right? The rapid way in which things work. Now, there's one little detail that might be worth bearing in mind, which is why are buildings constructed so quickly? Now, one reason, of course, is this, that they're constructed very quickly, partly because the rules, right, the permissions for doing that might change at any time, right? So it's like you have a kind of small window of opportunity. At the moment, you can build, like, according to these rules. You don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, what new minister would come into power, right? And when that happens, you know, the window of opportunity is gone. So Shenzhen speed, right? I mean, that's not the only explanation, but it's like a kind of, it's a detail that I think need also be taken into consideration. And of course, if you think about the quick way things happen in China, I mean, that of course isn't entirely true. This is really the mixture of two things, right? Things can be, if you're a practicing architect in China, you know, right? One of the things that happens is that things happen very slowly, right? Because there's this huge bureaucracy and it's not just, speed. It doesn't sort of happen in a kind of one-dimensional way. I mean, it sort of goes back and forth. But anyway, this whole issue, I suppose, of the specific spatial context where we can think about design is one of the issues that we're putting on the table. Now, another one would be, I think, stated most clearly by Achille yesterday, which is this whole problematic of power and aesthetics, right? The issue of power in design. And interestingly enough, and here we were really badly let down by the translation. Strangely enough, the presentation that came closest to this, but from a completely different angle, was Ah Chang's. Yeah, because what Ah Chang was talking about, and this could become an interesting lead up to what Achille was saying, is that he took this almost chinoiserie image, right, of the dragon. I mean, we know dragon and China and Chinese people. He took this and he submitted it to what you might call an archaeological reading, right? And by putting it through an archaeological reading, what he was able to tell us was that this identification of China and the dragon was based on a complete mistake, right? Because what he said was that the dragon was actually a vehicle of the emperor, not identified with the emperor. I mean, that's one of the key points it was made. In serious terms, it was more metonymy than metaphor. Right? It's not a metaphor for the emperor. It's the vehicle he uses. And also because of this, the dragon was in fact a hierarchical emblem, right? Because not everyone can use the dragon. So he made this comparison between motor cars, right? It's a distinction between the Rolls-Royce and the Volkswagen. Right? I mean, the dragon is a Rolls Royce. Everybody else would have people's vehicles. So it was a hierarchical mark, not as it were an emblem of the people at all. Right? I mean, it was a sign of hierarchy. Now, there are two really interesting historical implications that comes out from this. One is a historical one, because what it is in fact telling us, and that's what's so shocking about what he's saying, that that a lot of our historical self-understanding, right, descendants of the dragon and so on, a lot of our historical self-understanding is based on a lie. Right? It's almost like here we have a kind of Kafkian moment, like in a trial where Joseph K. discovers that the world order is based on a lie, and that's the emblem, right? You've got this emblem that you've been thinking about. It's actually a lie, a fake, right? Which was also what Achille was talking about. This is a fake emblem, and it's the fake, this fake and fakiness that allows you this historical self-understanding. Now, that's also very interestingly a subtle political implication to this emblem of the dragon, namely that those who claim to represent the people, right, descendants of the dragon and so on, and he can't say this, but one of the things you can substitute for this blank spot, those who claim to represent the people, the party, for example, right, are also those who are actually really dominating the people. Right? So this emblem about descendants, the dragon as a kind of almost a kind of democratic image. We are all descendants of the dragon. It's actually hierarchical and fuzzy and politically, right? It's a mark of a kind of political trick. Right? We represent you, i.e., you have to listen to us. Right? So it's a kind of domination in the guise of, right? In the fake clothing of representation. Now, I think to some extent, Achille developed a lot of this in I'm done. In a kind of different way, and so I mean there'll be other chances to do this. But maybe if we now sort of quickly conclude. One of the things that this might lead up to is a point that I think Sarah too was raising yesterday, which is, the need maybe through questioning design or through questions of design, come up with different modalities for critical analysis. And I think this is actually the project that is exciting so many people about what we're doing here. Right? How through questions of design, we can, in a kind of maybe interesting way, come up with different modalities for thinking and analyzing things. Okay.
All right, we're going to open it up to the group. So, yeah.
I was actually talking to Sarah yesterday about how I think Cheng's work has everything to do with design, in the sense that if you make the distinction between an instrument or a vehicle and the subject, or let's say essence, okay, in some ways it takes the what I think David proposed at the very beginning of the conference, the sign in design to a level which I think we can understand semiotically. And that is, one can think of the instrument in the sign system as the signifier, and the essence as a form of signified. So in a sense, I think what might be very interesting to do, and this is a discourse that's actually very, very well developed in contemporary art, is to think of what designers and artists do as a work on the signifier in relationship to the system of signification. And I'm glad that you brought up the tension between hierarchy and a proclamation of self-representation, in that if we think about a democracy of design, are we actually asking question about what represents the people, when in democracy, because far from the model of sovereignty, the mandate of heaven, etc., the people is an open question. The people is formless. So I think, with these ideas of the work on a signifier, I think that's where I want to pursue this.
Good. We keep all this in the air. And,
Okay, yeah. So is this a follow-up? No, I want to get the groups involved. Okay, I'm going to insist on this because otherwise it's going to involve what somebody 20 plus years ago characterized as petty bourgeois individualism. A form of it, right? Can we get groups represented by an individual too?
Hi, I'm representing Group F. We talked about several things which you brought up, Akbar. We talked about power and aesthetics, which we also think should be pursued, and we're really interested in that. But one of the important things that got brought up in our group by Vinay was the degree to which we're really dealing with a political economy of development, which is substantially at stake and maybe at a somewhat different register than some of these questions of design, though obviously there are many interconnections, points of interconnection. So we developed that for a while, and in regard to especially thinking about the role of land in the overall development process, the urban process, and ways that that represents power, and especially the people who have decision-making over what happens to the land. Because in the context of what is capital in late capitalism in China and its connections with the international system, the great capital in China is not foreign investment, but it's the land, and how it can be transformed by the state, which has control still over all of the land. And so that's one thing at stake, and because there's so many great works in film and other arenas of art and design that are looking at urban space in particularly kind of interesting ways and pushing on that, and yet there's a kind of underlying political economy of the state and state-society relationships that is a different kind of material context. And so that got brought up in our group. Anything else I should say? Is that okay? Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Anybody else from that group want to add anything to that?
I'm Simon. I'm the volunteer for Group B. I think the overall question that emerged for us, well, for me, I'm speaking on behalf of the group here, is that whether there's anything paradigmatically new about Shanghai. In other words, is it sort of completely unprecedented historically, or is it really just an accelerated moment in urbanization and capitalism? So sort of one of the questions that I'm here trying to figure out is, when I'm teaching this leading edge of Chinese design to my students back at UC Davis, can't I just legitimately make comparisons, let's say, with the experience of disorientation for people in Paris in the 19th century or in Chicago in the 19th century? Is there something so paradigmatically different about the experience of China now that I actually need new methods, rather than, let's say, just framing it as being part of another stage in the development of capitalism? Somebody in our group, for example, was able to draw some really interesting comparisons with what is happening in Shanghai now with what she's observed in Istanbul. So again, the creation of branded enclaves around the edge of the city. Whereas I'd been assuming that my traumatic experience of Thames Town was something that I would never have to go through again, it seems that might not be the case. Something else that was coming up as well was the problem of aesthetics. I appreciate what I've just heard there about the determination that we should have in the group to try and understand the relationship between power and design, and Akbar's been addressing that as well. But one of the things that I'm worried about, because I teach art history, is whether there is some distinct new mode of aesthetics in China, or whether such a thing will emerge, or whether China will continue to depend upon starchitects imported into China, and whether in the interim, as some of the people in our group were putting it, people, let's say in Shanghai, simply have to pass through a moment of chaos in which the aesthetic is one really of sort of bulk and skylines rather than detail and close-up individual buildings making some sort of new aesthetic statement. Maybe somebody else in the group wants to add to that.
Anybody else from that?
There's a hand there, there's a hand there.
One of the most interesting things about our group, I don't know if other groups experience this, is the question of translation and multiple conversations happening within our group. And it was really interesting to put the question of, to the folks that live in China or are from here, do they feel like they're a stranger in their own city? And the question is maybe not so much. Maybe feeling like, the streets here, they're still the streets. And so I'm interested in kind of maybe positioning who are we when we come into the conversation as well. And, what kind of positions are we bringing to that conversation?
We mostly talk about trying to find the kind of unit of analysis for urban development. Like Michael talked a lot about bits and pieces, so we're wondering, okay, starting from the Tanway system, and we kind of analyze a little bit how it worked, what it meant as a social organization, as in the mass line of hierarchical power. So starting from here, which are the implications when you live to a villa like the one we were watching? Who provides the services? Which are the implications in terms of mobility, in terms of services, of capitalization.
I guess, so who provides, for instance, hospital services? And one of the questions that kept coming up was places like Thamestown. How many people actually live there? Are these really inhabited? Because some of these areas are partially ghost towns. And we also talked about the ways in which, and I brought up some examples from India, where the big condo apartments to the condo buildings have often these spectral kind of flats or apartments where somebody buys it and then doesn't really live there for most of the year. So they remain vacant in very, very overpopulated cities of the world. This is happening. So this kind of spectral housing situation, we talked a little bit about that.
A few words from Group A. We were quite taken with thinking about, we were a little uncertain what Michael Keith actually meant to suggest by the significance of this Thames town. Was it an exemplar of creativity, of in creativity by replication and repetition? And we kind of tilted it in a different direction. We started thinking about it as an alternative type of utopian model town that contrasted maybe with the Soviet model towns of an earlier era, rather than of a real, that the relevant issue was not the real Europe versus Thamestown, but rather Soviet model, earlier utopian building communities to this new modeled after European model. We were also very taken by the notion of subjectivity, and we got into a great discussion about how does one know when one is Shanghainese? In a city with so much new migration, how long do you have to be here before you consider yourself to be from here? And the language debates that have appeared around this issue, kind of like English-only movements in the U.S. against immigrants. Shanghainese evidently have a certain sort of insistence on the speaking of Shanghainese versus Mandarin, which are privileged, seen as privileged by the government, because the Mandarin speakers are often those employees connected to the global industries, and they live in the exalted high buildings, and they are a kind of sublime subject that the Shanghainese feel that they are losing in a status.
We did talk about lots of other things, so I can only represent one particular thread in the conversation, and that is generated from Michael Keith's interesting suggestion that we should be, or maybe looking for alternative models to understand design in China. And then one person's response from our group that says, well, designing in Shanghai is so very Western, why shouldn't we be using Western theories to understand designing Shanghai at least? And then going back to yesterday's conversation, especially Ah Cheng's many lost points on us, lost in translation, but also lost because of our lack of history, and therefore not understanding the parody that he was making of both canonical understanding of Chinese culture and Chinese own understanding of Chinese culture. So much of it has to do with how we frame the questions and what language we use to discuss the subject. So that's only one of the themes.
Is this from the same?
Well, probably two more points to make is that we talk about, well, why we spend so much time to talk about fakes in this context of design, and why do we talk so much about architecture? Well, there are also other forms of design, but it seems to me within these 2 days, we talk a lot about architecture and fakes. And I think what our group think that is that there is a kind of historical reason for that. Well, for architecture, I think is one of the most theorized design discipline. So, and for the fix, is also related to consumerism, to psychoanalysis. So I think along these questions, one way to think is to how to ask the question is not just about how to think design, is to how to think the genealogy of design in a Foucauldian way. Is how to understand what makes design important now and why design is everywhere, and why design is a question that we should ask now.
We also had the small question of what on earth is design. I mean, this word that people keep throwing out, and actually, I think because people are coming from such different disciplines, I mean, this word design is assumed to have the same meaning, but actually functions differently in different disciplines.
Hi, my name is Erin Huang from UC Irvine. Our group talked about a diverse range of topics, and then I'm just going to go over just one. So one of the questions that we talked about, we started a discussion on the World Expo in Shanghai, and then later on I became interested in a comparison between cities. For example, the 2008 Olympic Games in Beijing, and then now we have the World Expo in Shanghai. And then also in Michael's talk, you talked about so many different cities, Tianjin, Shenzhen, Shanghai, etc. So the question that I want to pose is, how do we really think about a city without the comparison to these to all these other multiple sites? What does it mean to think of a city singularly, and how is that different from thinking of cities, Asian cities altogether?
Does anybody want to add anything to that? We're going to ask Michael to respond for a few minutes. Give you a few minutes.
I'll give you a moment to think about that. Another aspect that we talked about in this group, which I think it would be useful as part of the framework we've been talking about, is the difficulty when we've talked about fakes, originality, authenticity, and there tends to be these categories, which even when we don't want them to become binaries, tend to be when we speak about them in shorthand. And one of the things I thought was very productive in the background of what was happening in our group through many of the different subject areas we covered was the process. And the processes that are all there, hard to divine, complicated, you don't even know the entire process when you're working through it before you get to the thing that can be objectified. So for example, we spent a significant amount of time speaking about censorship understood broadly, but how that can be navigated very productively by the designer, the artist, the performer, the filmmaker, and how these movements aren't always so easily understood as authentic, fake, censored, controlled, and how those are all many different players with different positions are all interacting, and only much later, far after the fact, does someone else come in as the observer and say, oh, that's the object, that's the finished product.
Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe I could just start off by saying something. It may seem bizarre, but it was triggered by Akbar about if we think about speed, what speed does for a notion of equilibrium, and what that means in various languages, various formations. Even if we think about recent events over the last 7-8 months, and if you think about how the culture of money and how money can move through securitization to abstraction to forms of derivatives to forms of exotics to forms of hedging to forms of swaps, till the rationality of a system produces a scale of money cultures through which that their logics become such that they implode in the way in which we've seen, and that is another symptomatic of a Virilian speed at one sense, but it also might make us think slightly differently about the very notion of equilibrium. And I think I want to kind of just talk or hold that whilst thinking a little bit about to what extent we are placing Shanghai as paradigmatic. And I think there are languages. Part of what I was trying to intimate, I suppose, is the way that there are academic languages, there are journalistic languages, there are design languages that will play a game which I think has a kind of coffee table fascination, which is, Paris, capital of the 19th century, to Shanghai, capital of the 21st, with various intervening moments and claims to authority from Los Angeles to Lagos. And I think that there are interesting insights that can be generated from some of those games, and I think there are kind of analytical problems which are betrayed. Part of what I would like to argue, and what I was trying to suggest, is maybe picking up on Akbar's notion. One of Benjamin's notion of a profane illumination is, at one stage he says he came to know. He talks in Berlin Chronicles about the guides to Berlin, how he came to know the city, and I think he has about 5 or 6 guides, and one of his guides for knowing Berlin was Paris, and you come to know Berlin through knowing Paris, and that is precisely that sense of profane illumination, and it's a sense of juxtaposition that I think is a much more productive way sometimes of thinking about alterity, of thinking about changing form, so that the logics, to go back to some of the readings that we have, the logics of the biopolitical may be analytically true, they have an integrity of their own, but also, slightly contra Foucault, actually, it means taking history slightly seriously. It means we understand historiography as fictitious, as readings of power, and with all of the kind of caveats that we might have, we do need to understand the path dependencies that emerge. And so, picking up on coming back to Shanghai and so on, I think that there is Shanghai paradigmatic? Is it not paradigmatic? I think is both an interesting question on some levels, and I think it works, and in some ways it's not so interesting. So I think I think we can all see that those kind of mini commodified identity lifestyle stuff is you can pick up almost anywhere in the world. I think maybe Thamestown is a particularly kind of acute articulation, but it's an acute articulation of some kinds of lifestyle marketing that we're familiar with from many places and many sites. But I do think, coming back to Akbar's point, that Virilio actually cast himself, I think, at one stage he says that he is a Benjamin of later times. So I think there is a direct kind of link across there, and that link is through technology. So in the same way that there is a kind of Benjaminian take about how technologies make a certain kind of visualization possible, and I think this does lead into some of the design problematics. And so that photography obviously makes a certain kind of city imaginable, and notions of multimedia are partly, and I think Virilio is clearly influential in certain kinds of media and cultural studies for exactly this reason, that they are, in the same way as we might look for a 21st century Zimmel, I was arguing, you might look for a 21st century Benjamin partly through thinking that metaphor of technology and taking it seriously. And clearly there is a link in there as to why people like Latour become important, because there is thinking through the social production of those technologies. But I think alongside those technologies, there is a sense of the legal and the powerful, and coming back to Achille's talk yesterday, the power of the aesthetic and the aesthetics of power demand that we think these things alongside each other as well, in a similar kind of juxtaposition. And I suppose by that what I mean is that there is something in, going back to yesterday and a comment Sarah made as well, that is potentially productive about a Latourian sense of the social always being in the future, something that is in assembly rather than being overdetermined, that is something that is some kind of Durkheimian structural form. And the fact that it is a fabrication or an imaginary of the future, though I think, and I don't think this is what Sarah was saying, so I don't want to misrepresent, but I think that almost demands new sociological imaginaries rather than an end of the sociological project. So when we think through what that means for design, I think that means thinking through how particular articulations of speed, path dependency, and disequilibrium work alongside regimes of power and truth. And I think what that does mean is taking seriously in the context of China debates about how we think about very, very fundamental notions of property in the abstract and property in the concrete. So if we are thinking about the land, as somebody said a second ago, the land banks of power and their interface with either FDI or other forms, that generates certain kinds of potential. But at the same time, there is something quite important, I think, about the ways in which intellectual property, fuzzy rights, do or don't work differently here in allowing certain kinds of creativity to become realized in things, in objects, in the fabrications of design. And so I think what that means is taking seriously the articulation differently in Shanghai, in China, of analytical dynamics that may be simultaneously present in different parts of the world.